Welcome back to another episode of Bloodstained Backstories. I'm your host, Jace.
And I'm your host, Summer.
Today's episode may have some content that is disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Where is the happiest place that most kids like to go? McDonald's. They love the toy and the happy meal, the relaxed atmosphere, and being there with their family. It should be a day of smiles. But not on July 18th, 1984, in the San Ysidro McDonald's. It was a day of sadness and terror. Listen as our story unfolds, and we take you on this wild journey. A scary ride of 77 minutes of pure hell for the patrons at one McDonald's restaurant.
On July 15th, 1984, James Huberty told his wife that he believed he had a mental health problem. On the morning of July 17th, just 2 days after he told his wife what he was feeling, he called a San Diego mental health clinic requesting an appointment. James talked to a receptionist and left his contact information and details as to why he was requesting the appointment. James was assured by the receptionist that someone would call him back within a few hours. James's wife Etna noted that James sat by the phone quietly for several hours waiting for the clinic to call him back. He all of a sudden walked abruptly out of the family home, took his motorcycle, and went on a ride to an unknown destination.
It later became known that the receptionist had misspelled James's name. She spelled it Schuberty instead of Huberty. Plus, his politeness on the phone conveyed no sense of urgency to the receptionist. He had also stated while on the phone that he had never been hospitalized for mental health issues. Since there did not seem a sense of urgency, the call was logged as a non crisis inquiry to be handled within 48 hours.
What a shame that was to promise him a call back in a couple hours and then log it as a non crisis call. The receptionist should not have promised a call within a couple hours. Had they actually taken this serious, the events that take place next may not have happened because he would have received the help he needed. James returned home about an hour later when he seemed to be in a contented mood. The family ate dinner together and they went on a family bike ride husband, wife, and two daughters. Later that evening, when they came home, James and Etna watched a movie together.
The following day, Wednesday, July 18th, the family had a fun filled morning together at the San Diego Zoo. While walking through the zoo, James told his wife that he believed his life was effectively over. He then made a comment which he was referring to the mental health clinic he called the day before. He stated, well, society had their chance. They ate lunch at a McDonald's in Claremont, not far from the zoo, and then they returned home.
Shortly after arriving home, Etna was lying on their bed relaxing when James walked into the room wearing a marine t shirt and camouflage pants. He leaned towards his wife on the bed and said, I want to kiss you goodbye. Etna gave her husband a kiss and asked where he was going, informing him that she was going to start dinner soon. James calmly replied that he was going hunting. He wasn't hunting rabbits, though, he was hunting humans.
James walked toward the front door carrying a gun across his shoulder, a box of ammunition, and a bundle wrapped in a checkered blanket. He glanced toward his oldest daughter, Zelia, and said, Goodbye, I won't be back. How confused his family must have been.
Eyewitnesses said James drove down the San Ysidro Boulevard, first towards the Big Bear supermarket and then towards the post office. He then entered a parking lot of McDonald's. The McDonald's was approximately 20 yards from his apartment.
Now we know the hours leading up to the horrific event, but before we go further, let's get to know James Huberty. James was born on October 11, 1942, in Canton, Ohio. He was the second of two children. Both his parents were very religious, and the family often attended a local United Methodist church.
James walked with a limp as he contracted polio when he was 3 years old. He wore steel and leather braces on both legs as a child and eventually made enough of a recovery that he didn't need to wear them anymore. But he walked with a mild limp for the remainder of his life.
In 1950, James's dad purchased a 155-acre farm in Mount Eaton, but his mother refused to even go see the property as she refused to live in a rural location. Shortly after the purchase of the farm, she abandoned the family and went on to perform sidewalk preaching as a Pentecostal missionary in Tucson, Arizona. James was emotionally devastated that his mother abandoned them, and his father would later recall finding his son leaning against the chicken coop, sobbing.
James had few friends growing up, and he was most interested in spending his time target practicing. He was frequently bullied at school, and he graduated 51st out of his class of 77 students in 1960. He enrolled in college in 1962 and originally planned to study sociology, but that soon changed when he attended the Pittsburgh Institute of Mortuary Science, and he graduated with honors in 1964 with his funeral director's license, and then a following year he received his embalmer's license.
In early 1965, he married Etna, and shortly after they got married, he landed employment at a funeral home in Canton. He was very proficient at embalming, but his introverted personality did not go well when dealing with members of the public. He worked there for 2 years before he decided to become a welder for a firm in Louisville.
In June of 1969, he secured a better paying job at Badcock and Wilcox. James's employers considered him to be a reliable worker who was willing to work overtime, and he earned promotions that by the mid 1970s he was making $25,000 to $30,000 a year, which for this time was actually a very decent salary. James and Etna bought a 3-story home in an affluent section of Malleson, Ohio, but sadly in the winter of 1971 their home was destroyed by a fire. They purchased another house on the same street a few years later and built a 6-unit apartment building on the property of their first home. James and Edna's daughters, Zalia and Cassandra, were born in 1972 and 1974.
Sounds like a picture perfect family. Father had a good job, stay at home mother, two beautiful children, nice house, and special added income with the apartment building. But behind closed doors was a different story. James had a history of domestic violence. He would frequently slap or punch his daughters and hold knives to their throats. At one point, Etna filed a report with the Canton Department of Children and Family Services, stating that James had messed up her jaw. She later insisted that the majority of time he had assaulted her, he struck her only one time. Starting in 1976, Etna attempted many times to persuade her husband to go to counseling to help him with his stress. He refused to seek any form of therapy. Etna went to great lengths to minimize agitating her husband. She developed a way to calm James, and that was by claiming she could tell his future by reading tarot cards. James believed her and her readings, producing a calming effect, and James would follow her recommendations that she made during the readings.
James was a conspiracy theorist and a self-proclaimed survivalist. James believed the Cold War was inevitable and that the presidents in office at the time and the United States government were conspiring against him. James believed that a breakdown of society was approaching fast. He prepared to survive if the future held such problems, and he stocked his house with supplies of non-perishable foods and numerous guns, and he intended to use them to defend his home. A family friend stated that James's home had so many loaded firearms that wherever James was sitting or standing within the home, he could just reach over and get a gun. The guns were always loaded and the safety catch was disabled.
In November 1982, James was laid off from his welding job, causing him to become despondent over his dire financial situation and his inability to provide for his family. A former co-worker recalled that James had made a comment after he was notified that the company was closed, hence the layoff, that if he was unable to provide for his family, he was going to commit suicide and take everyone with him. Shortly after his unemployment, Etna said James began hearing voices. In early 1983, he put a loaded pistol against his temple and threatened to commit suicide. Etna was successful at getting James to put the gun down, but he later told her, "You should have let me shoot myself."
James had trouble finding lasting employment in Ohio, so they sold their apartment building for $115,000 in the spring of 1983. James was able to find welding employment for 5 weeks before the plant closed down. As if things couldn't get any worse for James in his mental condition, James and one of his daughters were injured in a car accident. James noted an aggravation in his neck pains that he had endured since he was a child. It was also noted that on occasion he would have an increasing nerve tremor in his hands and arms. During the summer of 1983, James applied for resident in Mexico for him and his family. He believed the money from the sale of the apartment would last longer if they moved to Mexico. They sold their home for $12,000 cash, with the buyer assuming their mortgage of $48,000. The family moved to Tijuana, Mexico in October of 1983. They put most of their belongings in storage, but of course he took his large collections of guns, ammunition, and survival supplies. Edna and the children became friends with the neighbors, but James was having a hard time as he spoke very little Spanish. James was unable to find employment and regretted his decision to move to Mexico. So within 3 months, the family moved to San Ysidro, a largely poor district of San Diego, just north of the Mexico-United States border. The population in 1984 was just 13,000.
In their new location, the family rented an apartment while James looked for work. While searching the newspaper, James saw an advertisement for security guard training in a federally funded program. He finished the course on April 12th and obtained employment with a security firm guarding a condominium complex. They had their furniture shipped from Ohio and moved to a two-bedroom apartment where the rent was $450 a month. On July 10th, James was dismissed from his job. His employers told him the reason for the dismissal was his poor work performance and a noted general physical instability.
Now that we are familiar with James and his situation and problems and his family, let's get back to the sad and terror-filled day at McDonald's.
Remember, it was July 18th, approximately 3:56 p.m., when James drove into the McDonald's parking lot. In his possession, he had a wide array of weapons. He came equipped with a 9mm Browning HP semi-automatic pistol, a 9mm Uzi carbine, a Winchester 1200 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, a box and a cloth bag filled with hundreds of rounds of ammo for each weapon. There were a total of 45 customers inside the restaurant. That is a lot of customers inside of McDonald's. Now is when you need to pay attention and keep a tally of James's moves and the people he shot.
Upon entering the restaurant, James first aimed his gun at a 16-year-old employee named John Arnold from just about 15 feet away from him. The assistant manager saw James aiming the gun at John and shouted, "Hey John, the guy is going to shoot you." According to Arnold, when James pulled the trigger, the gun jammed and nothing happened. As James was checking out the gun, the manager of the restaurant, 22-year-old Neva Kane, walked towards the service counter in the direction of John Arnold. John thought it was a distasteful joke and began walking away from James. James pointed the gun at the ceiling and fired, and then aimed his Uzi at Kane, shooting her beneath the left eye. She died a few minutes later. After shooting Kane, James immediately fired a shotgun at John, hitting him in the chest and arms. James then yelled a comment that went something like, "Everybody on the ground." He then referred to everyone in the restaurant as dirty swine and Vietnam assholes, and he claimed he killed 1,000 and that he intended to kill 1,000 more. Upon seeing James shoot John and Kane, and hearing his profane rant and try to persuade, James started screaming, shut up," as he shot Victor 14 times, and Victor screamed in pain.
The staff and customers tried to hide beneath the tables and service booths, but James turned his attention towards 6 women and children that were huddled together. First, he shot 19-year-old Maria Calmanera Silva with a single shot to the chest. Then he turned to 9-year-old Claudia Perez by shooting her in the stomach, cheek, thigh, hip, leg, chest, back, armpit, and her head with his Uzi. Then he went to Perez's sister, Imelda, who was 15 years old, and shot her once in the hand using the same weapon. He then fired at Aurora Pena with his shotgun. Pena initially was wounded in her leg. Her pregnant aunt, 18-year-old Jackie Reyes, had shielded her. Listeners, brace yourself for this now. James then shot Reyes, the aunt, 48. Yes, 48 times with the Uzi. Lying beside her was her 8-month-old baby, Carlos Reyes. He sat up and wailed. James took no mercy on the infant. He shouted at the baby and then killed him with a single shot from the pistol to the center of his back.
James is just getting started. James's next victim was 62-year-old trucker named Lawrence Versluis, who he shot and killed. Then he targeted a family seated near the play area who were trying to shield their son and his friend beneath the tables with their bodies. Blythe Reagan Herrera, who was 31 years old, shielded her son Mateo beneath one booth, and her husband Ronald protected Mateo's friend, 12-year-old Keith Thomas, beneath a booth directly across from his wife and son. Ronald begged the boy not to move, shielding him with his body. Thomas was shot in the shoulder, arm, wrist, and left elbow, but thankfully was not seriously wounded. Ronald was shot 6 times in the stomach, chest, arm, hip, shoulders, and head, but survived. Unfortunately, his wife and son did not survive. They were both killed by numerous gunshots to the head.
And still, the shooting continues. 3 women attempted to hide beneath a booth. 24-year-old Guadalupe Del Rio lay against the wall. She was being shielded by her friends, 25-year-old Gloria Ramirez and 31-year-old Arisdelcy Volvas Vargas. Del Rio survived being hit several times, but was not seriously wounded. Ramirez was unhurt. Sadly, Vargas took a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. She died the next day from her wound. She was the only person that was fatally wounded who lived long enough to go to the hospital. In another booth, James killed Hugo Velazquez Vasquez, a 45-year-old banker, with a single shot to his chest.
The first of many calls came to emergency services shortly after 4 p.m. The calls were notifying the police of a shooting of a child who had been taken to the post office across the street. The dispatcher accidentally directed responding officers to another McDonald's that was 2 miles away. What a very unfortunate mistake. This mistake, although an accident, would cause the delay in the lockdown by several minutes. The only warnings to civilians near the restaurant were given by people who were passing by and saw what was going on. Also, shortly after 4 p.m., a young woman named Lydia Flores drove into the parking lot. She was pulling up to the pickup window when she noticed the shattered windows and heard the sounds of gunfire. As she looked up, there he was just shooting. Lydia reversed her car until she crashed into a fence. She took her 2-year-old daughter and they hid in some bushes until the shooting ended.
Approximately at 4:05 p.m., Astolfo and Maricela Felix, a Mexican couple, drove toward one of the service areas of the restaurant. Astolfo saw the shattered glass but thought maybe there was renovation work being performed. James was striding towards the car and Astolfo thought he was a repairman. James opened fire on the couple and their 4-month-old daughter with his Uzi and the shotgun. Marcella was hit in the face, arms, and chest, blinding her one eye and rendering her one hand unusable. The baby was critically wounded in the neck, chest, and abdomen. Astolfo was wounded in the chest and head. As the couple staggered away from James's line of fire, Marcella gave the baby to her husband, who in turn handed the crying baby to a young woman named Lucia Velasco, as Marcella collapsed on the car against the car. Velasco rushed the baby to a nearby hospital as her husband assisted Astolfo and Marcella into a nearby building. Fortunately, the 3 members of the Felix family survived.
Not knowing that there was a mass shooting going on, 3 11-year-old boys rode their BMX bikes into the west parking lot. The boys hesitated when they heard someone yell from across the street, but they didn't make out what was said. James shot the boys with his Uzi and his shotgun. Joshua Coleman fell to the ground, critically wounded in the back, arm, and legs. Joshua called later, looking towards his friend Omar Alfonso and David Flores Delgado, noting that Omar was on the ground with multiple gunshot wounds to his back and he had started vomiting. His other friend, David, received several gunshot wounds to his head. Coleman is the only one of the 3 to have survived, and the other 2 died at the scene. An elderly couple, 74-year-old Miguel Victoria Ulola and 69-year-old Ida Velasquez Victoria were walking towards the entrance when James noticed them. Miguel reached to the open door for his wife, and James fired his shotgun, hitting her in the face, killing her and wounding Miguel. A survivor who was uninjured, Oscar Mondragon, reported later that Miguel cradled his wife in his arms and wiped blood off her face. Miguel was shouting curses at James, who approached the doorway, swore at Miguel, and shot him in the head, killing him.
Approximately 10 minutes after the first call had been placed to the emergency services, police arrived at the correct McDonald's. The first officer to arrive at the scene was Miguel Rosario. He rapidly determined the location and cause of the disturbance and relayed this information to the San Diego Police Department. James fired at Rosario's patrol car. Officers were sent immediately and imposed a lockdown on the area spanning for 6 blocks from the shooting site. A command post was set up 2 blocks from the restaurant, and 175 officers were deployed and placed in numerous strategic locations. Within the hour, several SWAT team members joined the officers and took position around the restaurant. Since the restaurant's windows had been shattered by gunfire, there were reflections from the shards of glass that made it more difficult for the police trying to focus on the inside of the restaurant. Initially, the police were concerned that there might be more than one gunman and that they might be holding hostages and shooting any individual he encountered. At 5:05 p.m., all the responding law enforcement personnel were authorized to kill the shooter or shooters should they obtain a clear shot. An individual who had escaped from the restaurant informed the police that there was a single gunman in the restaurant. He wasn't holding any hostages, and he was shooting any individual he encountered.
Several of the survivors later reported that they saw James walk towards the service counter, scrolling through radio stations. Maybe he was looking for news reports on the shooting, but he finally selected a music station. As he danced to the music, he continued shooting people. James searched the kitchen area where he discovered 6 employees, and he shouted, "Oh, there's more! You're trying to hide from me, you bastards!"
One of the female employees yelled in Spanish, "Don't kill me! Don't kill me!" James opened fire on them, killing 21-year-old Paulina Lopez, 19-year-old Elsa Barbero Fierro, and 18-year-old Margarita Padilla. He critically wounded 17-year-old Albert Leos. Before James started shooting, Padilla grabbed the hand of her friend and colleague, 17-year-old Wendy Flanagan, before the two started to run. James fatally shot Padilla. Flanagan, plus 4 other employees, a female customer, and her infant, hid inside a basement utility room. They were joined later by Leos, who had crawled to the utility room after being shot 5 times. James was shooting at anything that moved, including a fire truck that drove within range. He repeatedly pierced the fire truck with bullets and slightly wounded the one occupant.
A wounded teenager, 19-year-old Jose Perez, was moaning when James heard his moans, and he shot him in the head, killing him. Jose slumped beside the booth he had been seated with his friend and neighbor, 22-year-old Gloria Gonzalez, and a young woman named Michelle Carncross. Remember Aurora Pena, who lay beside her dead aunt, infant cousin, and 2 friends? Well, she was still alive. When she heard the lull in shooting, she opened her eyes and saw James staring in her direction. He uttered a curse word, threw a bag of french fries at her, and picked up his shotgun and shot her in the arm, neck, and jaw. Aurora survived, although she remained hospitalized longer than any other victim.
At 5:17 p.m., James walked from the service counter towards the doorway, close to the drive-through window. This move gave 27-year-old Charles Foster, a police sniper, who was deployed to a strategic position on the roof of the post office directly opposite the restaurant, a chance to take out James. Through his telescopic sight on his .308 caliber rifle, Charles had an unobstructed view of James's body from the neck down. Charles fired a single shot from a range of about 35 yards. The bullet hit James, entering through his chest, severed his aorta just beneath his heart, and exited through his spine. The bullet left a 1 square inch exit wound and sent James sprawling backwards onto the floor directly in front of the service counter. The shot killed him almost instantly.
Immediately after shooting James, Charles relayed to the other officers that had responded that he had killed the perpetrator and that his focus remained on the motionless suspect. There were so many rounds that had been fired from different guns, police were not completely certain that the sole perpetrator was dead. About 1 minute later, the police sergeant entered the restaurant and focused his gun on James. He noticed movement of a wounded girl and asked her if the deceased male was the shooter. The girl nodded her head.
The entire incident lasted for 77 minutes. That is a long time for a mass shooting to last. James had fired a minimum of 257 rounds of ammunition. He killed 20 people and wounded as many others. One who was pronounced brain dead upon arrival at the hospital died the next day. 17 of the victims were killed inside the restaurant and 4 in the immediate vicinity. Only 10 individuals inside the restaurant were uninjured. 6 of them had hidden inside the basement utility room. Several victims had tried to stop their own bleeding and or the wounds of their companions from bleeding with napkins, but their efforts were in vain.
Of the people who were killed, 13 died from gunshot wounds to the head, 7 from gunshot wounds to the chest, and one victim, the 8-month-old baby, died from a gunshot wound in his back. The victims ranged from ages 4 months to 74 years. The victims were predominantly, although not exclusively, of Mexican or Mexican American ancestry, which reflected the local demographics.
James shouted accusations or insults prior to shooting several of the victims. On one occasion, James shouted that he himself did not deserve to live and that he was taking care of the situation. James repeatedly shouted throughout the shooting spree that he had been a veteran of the Vietnam War, but in all actuality, he never even served in the military branch.
Reports issued by the San Diego Police Department following the massacre indicated that everyone who was injured or killed within the restaurant had been shot by James in the minutes after he first entered the restaurant. Survivors of the massacre hotly disputed that and stated that James had shot both wounded and unwounded people over 40 minutes after he first opened fire.
The day following the massacre, reporters visited James's father in Mount Eaton, Ohio, to gain further information about his son. He discussed James's childhood and the family's religious background. Earl Huberty pointed to a painting of a lost sheep by the Jordan River and began to weep. He informed reporters, "Yesterday was the worst day of my life. I feel so sorry for those people."
In the days following the massacre, McDonald's suspended all television and radio advertisements. In an act of solidarity, Burger King, an arch rival of McDonald's, also suspended all forms of advertising temporarily.
James was cremated on July 23, 1984. There was no official religious service observed throughout this act. His ashes were returned to his widow and later laid to rest in his home state of Ohio.
In the weeks following the massacre, James's wife and children had to temporarily stay with family friends because of death threats they were receiving. All 3 attended counseling sessions over the next 9 months.
James's wife and daughters initially relocated to Chula Vista, where the children went to school under assumed names. 1 year later, they moved to Spring Valley in San Diego County.
Because of the number of victims, local funeral homes had to use the Civic Center to hold wakes for each victim. The local church, Mount Carmel Church, was forced to hold back-to-back funeral masses in order that each deceased person could be buried in a timely manner.
Several of the police officers who responded to the scene suffered symptoms including sleep withdrawal, loss of memory, and guilt in the months following. A study commissioned by the National Institute of Mental Health and conducted by the chief psychologist of the San Diego Police Department in 1985 concluded several officers suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of the incident.
Following the massacre, the police department increased training for special units and they purchased more powerful firearms to better equip law enforcement officers who responded to the scenes of scenarios of this magnitude.
San Diego Police Chief William Collender held a press conference on August 2nd. He disclosed the results of the San Diego Police Department's inquiry into their response to the massacre and the fact that 73 minutes had passed from the time the first officer had arrived on the scene in James's death. The results revealed that although the arrival of the SWAT team was delayed by rush hour traffic, the police acted appropriately in the method of response. Collins stated that any suggestions that the police should have stormed the building was ludicrous, adding that the officers had been unable to obtain a clear view of the gunman because the windows had been spiderwebbed by bullet holes, thus making visibility in direct sunlight difficult. Collins emphasized that the 8-minute delay between the passing of the instruction authorizing all law enforcement personnel to kill James and his death made no difference in the death toll from that day. He finished his report stating, "I believe the operation was handled the way it should have been handled." When questioned in regards to what the actual motive behind James's murder spree, Collins dismissed any notion of a racial motive behind the massacre, informing reporters he didn't like anybody.
The restaurant was refurbished and renovated within 2 days of the massacre. The plan was for the restaurant to reopen for business, but following discussion between community leaders and McDonald's executives, a decision was reached on July 24th that it would not reopen. On September 26th at midnight, the restaurant was demolished.
McDonald's donated the location to the restaurant on the grounds that no restaurant would be built on that site. In February of 1988, the land was sold to a college for $136,000. McDonald's announced its commitment to donate $1 million to a survivors fund. The widow of McDonald's founder, Joan Kroc, added a personal contribution of $100,000 to assist in the burial costs, financial aid for the relatives of the deceased, and counseling for survivors. The total sum of donations received would exceed $1.4 million. Amidst protests from some residents and donors, Edna Huberty received the first payout from this fund.
Several family members of those killed, along with the survivors of the massacre, filed a lawsuit against McDonald's and the San Diego Police Department. Their suits were heard in the San Diego Supreme Court. All the lawsuits were consolidated and later dismissed before trial on a defense motion for summary judgment. The plaintiffs appealed the ruling, and the California Court of Appeal on July 25, 1987, affirmed the summary judgments for the defendants, ruling that McDonald's or any other business had no duty to care to protect patrons from the unforeseeable assault of a murderous madman, and the implemented security measures usually used by restaurants such as guards or closed-circuit television cameras would not have deterred James, as he did not care for his own survival. The final lawsuits were dismissed in August of 1991.
Edna Huberty filed a lawsuit in July of 1991 against both McDonald's and her husband's longtime former employee, Babcock and Wilcox. The civil suit, seeking $5 million in damages, asserted that her husband's killing spree had been triggered by the combination of a poor diet and her husband's working around highly poisonous metals without adequate protection.
Over the years, since there were no traces of alcohol or drugs in his system as determined by the autopsy, his actions were not influenced by either factor. The alleged accruals of high levels of lead and cadmium discovered in James's body at his autopsy had more than likely accumulated by an ongoing exposure to the fumes that he inhaled for the 13 years that he had been employed as a welder without a sufficient respiratory protection. Plus, the ingesting of high levels of monosodium glutamate in the staple McDonald's food he ate regularly and induced delusions of uncontrollable rage. The lawsuit was dismissed in 1987, and Edna died of breast cancer in 2003.
Survivor Albert Leo spent 3 months in the hospital undergoing several surgeries to remove bullets, and then he spent 2 years in therapy healing from those injuries. He became a police officer and served in several police departments in the South Bay region of San Diego County. Leos later joined the San Diego Police Department and was made captain.
30 years after the massacre, James's daughter Zelia has finally spoken out. She stated that if she knew what her father had planned, she would have killed him. She was 12 at the time of the massacre, and she stated that she is in complete opposition of her father, and now she is a nurse and she helps others. She still cannot shake the trauma and has learned to deal with it. She also stated that not a day goes by that she doesn't think about it or relive it.
Thanks for tuning in to Bloodstained Backstories. Don't forget to follow us on social media to stay updated. Share your thoughts and connect with fellow crime enthusiasts. You can catch us anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your go-to platform. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Join us next week as we uncover another chilling case. Until then, stay safe and stay curious.